Well, good morning, everyone. Or good evening, depending on where you guys are tuning in from. Great to have you guys all back watching the attendee count come in, which is always a thrill to see you guys all logging on and get started. This is the third and final one of our Everest Experience lecture series. So it's been amazing having you all on board. We're very grateful that you've come and spent the time with us. We're doing this because we want to be in the mountains and we can't be right now, but two, because we really believe at Climbing the Seven Summits that well-educated clients that have kind of that preparation are usually safe and successful climbers, and that makes the mountain safer for everyone. So today we are going to go through training for Everest and training for big mountains, and we're also going to hit gear. So I'm going to share out my screen and we can get into it. So let's, here we are, the Everest Experience, episode number 3. So to get started, you guys, by now, week 3, you probably know me. I'm Caroline, I'm your moderator, I'm the general manager of Climbing the Seven Summits. We have Mike again. He had a few technical difficulties this morning, but just slid in, getting them sorted just in time. Mike doesn't need much introduction, 6 times Everest summiteer, author of the guidebook Climbing the Seven Summits, and obviously our expedition leader. And then we're so lucky to have some awesome panelists for you guys today. We have uphill athlete, elite coach, Mark Postle, who I hear is a 5.14. I don't even know how to say that, Mark. It's terrible, but like, you're a ninja rock climber, you're a top ultra athlete, you've got 20 years of guiding experience under your belt, you're the head guide at Jackson Hole Mountain Guides, and you're really good at running uphill and downhill, I hear, this week. So we've got Mark with us, and then our next panelist is a fellow Aussie. We're taking over today. He is Steve Plain. He's a world record 7 summiter. So he's this, I call him Speedy Steve. He lapped the 7 summits in an amazing under 4 months, 117 days. He climbed Everest and Lhotse in a single day, and he's the Australian Adventurer of the Year. But beyond that, he also climbed Denali in winter. So that's pretty impressive. So I'm just going to go back, and I want to ask you, oh, hold on, I need to see my slides aren't working. I want to ask you, Mike, before we move on, how do you personally train for Everest? You've done it 6 times to the summit. You've had multiple expeditions. How do you train for Everest?
Personally, I've got a bit of a leg up being a mountain guide. I'm always in the mountains with a pack on my back. So, that allows me to be in mountain shape all the time. But when I'm not in the mountains guiding, say I have a long stretch of time before a Mount Everest expedition, I do a lot of ski touring. It's fairly specific to mountain climbing. It's fun. I enjoy it. So that keeps me motivated. It's a way that I can get a lot of vertical back-to-back days and be ready for Mount Everest and enjoy it as well. I do a lot of mountain running as well. That's high intensity. Also, I enjoy it. So it's something I want to do. And I do some gym work as well, just general fitness, core fitness, and rock climbing in the gym and outside as well.
Awesome. And jumping over to you, Mark, you're a coach, but what advice do you remember being given, or what advice have you used personally as an athlete and a climber that has really helped you perform beyond just being a coach?
Yeah, I think one piece that somebody told me a long time ago was, don't let the intended workout get in the way of just getting started and getting something done. So a lot of times, you have a program, whether it's, self-inflicted or you have a coach, and you just don't have enough motivation to easily get out the door and get it done. And you just need to break it into smaller chunks. Just get started, put it, whatever it is, put on your shoes, get out the door, just go for 10 minutes and just see how you feel. And a lot of times, if you go for 10 minutes, you go for 15 minutes, you get warmed up, you get in the mode, you're psyched, and the workout goes fine. So sometimes these big these big training bouts that you need to do for mountain climbing are kind of overwhelming. You look on the calendar and it says, oh, I need to go for 5 hours, you know, and it's like such this big thing. And if you just get started and let it fall into place, and most of the time that really helps.
Nice one. Awesome advice. And then Speedy Steve, I hope you don't mind me calling that. You know, I love your story, and I'm going to quickly tell everyone your story because they might not know. But in 2014, you were dumped by a big wave at the beach, and you actually sustained multiple unstable fractures to your neck, right? So you broke your neck in 3 places, I think, and contorted spinal cord, ruptured disc, a dissected arterial artery, all of these horrible injuries. And the promise you made yourself was, I'm going to, 1, walk out of the hospital, even though the doctors have told me I may never walk again. I'm going to walk out of the hospital, and then 2, I'm going to go climb the 7 summits and be the fastest man in the world to do so. And you achieved those goals, and the power of the dream to the rest of us is quite amazing. But, you know, when I asked you to be on the panel, you said to me, well, you know, I might be a bit too amateur as a climber to be on the panel, which, you know, we had to laugh at. But you consider yourself you weren't a climber, and you became one very, very quickly. That said, you certainly did your time in the mountains before you headed up Everest. But what is one piece of golden advice that you wish that someone had given you at the beginning of that journey when you were just starting off, that you now know, having completed the 7 summits? I'm just going to unmute you just quickly. Hopefully we can all hear you in a second. Are you there, Speedy Steve? I've still got Mark and Mike, but I don't have... Oh, there you are.
Caroline.
There you are, yay.
Yeah, thank you very much, and wonderful to join you. Yeah, my one piece of advice I'd say is learning good self-management on the hill. As you said, I started out from 0 mountaineering experience basically when I first decided to do the 7 summits, and probably a little bit crazy at the time. And I do believe you can compress the journey to Everest, but there's certain shortcuts you can't take, and there's certain experiences you can only get through time on the hill, and you need to have that experience, that background before turning up at Everest Base Camp. I think a lot of the focus, and when I went through my own journey and all the research and the information you get, it's all around the route, climbing preparation, gear, training, which we'll go through today. The physical aspects of the climb itself, very little is talked about, just the, what happens in between the actual climbing aspect and how to actually look after yourself on the hills. So how to stay hydrated, how to stay, good nutrition, how to stay warm with proper layering systems. I think it's all those little points that are really, really crucial. And I think far too often you'll see on the hill, people are rocking to, after a day's climbing, get to camp, they'll dump that pack down, slump on that pack, exhausted, too tired. I think that's the exact time when you really need to start focusing on your recovery and your recovery and preparation for your climb tomorrow, because if you don't, it just compounds out more and more each day. So when you get into camp, first thing you should be doing, getting some water, starting to get the stove on, melt some water down so you can get rehydrated, get your sleeping system set up for the night, sort your gear out, get stuck into some food, some good cheese, salami, whatever you got on your trek, and doing all those things to just in between the actual climbing, prepare and recover so you can back up day after day. And I think just, that self-management is really crucial to climbing, to the expedition climbing in particular.
Yeah, whenever you're on a hill with Mike, I'm gonna dob you in, throw you under the bus, Mike. But whenever you're on the hill with Mike, he's on you all the time about eating and drinking and exactly that self-care. So that's an awesome little bit of advice, taking care of yourself. So guys, you've joined us before, you know how it works. We're going to go through the topics. If you can put any of your questions in the chat box, we'll moderate them to a degree while we go, but most of them we'll try and get to at the end if we have time, having a look there. So that's where you can talk to us in the chat box. A little shout out to 1 a.m. in Morocco for Nawal. So thanks for joining us at 1 a.m. And then we are recording the session. So hopefully we'll be able to post that up as well if you drop out or anything like that. So that's just a little bit of housekeeping. Listen closely. We've got some amazing advice for you and an amazing panel. So I think that we better get back in the Himalaya, get our heads in the game, and let's head out there now. The Himalaya, the highest points on our planet. born from a mighty collision of tectonic plates so powerful it pushed the Earth above the clouds. The centre point? Mount Everest. Standing at 8,850 metres, it is both spectacular and formidable. It attracts mountaineers from all over the world as the ultimate challenge. These are goal-driven people willing to commit themselves to the dedication that it takes to earn the privilege of standing for a few minutes on the summit, looking out over our world. Not to be underestimated, Mount Everest is not just an enormous physical feat, it is also a mental test of perseverance. So what separates those who succeed from those who fail? Strategy, experience, teamwork, vision, execution. Everest. It has the power to transform ordinary people into extraordinary achievers. Do you have what it takes? Okay, so hopefully you are off your armchairs and back into the mountain mind frame. Today, obviously, we are tackling training, which is such a huge component. We get heaps of questions about this. So instead of us answering them, we're going to bring in, one of the very, very best in the game. We're so lucky to have Mark Postle with us. So Mark, I'm going to hand over to you in a moment. Mark is going to take us through some of those common mistakes, some mountain tip training strategies, even for people who don't necessarily live in the mountains. I know down here in Australia, in Perth, in Sydney, we find that kind of hard, but apparently we don't have any excuses. So Mark's going to help us understand what foundations we really need to put in place with our training. So Mark, if you want to unmute and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I would like to just first start by setting the stage for training. I think that training is a thing that's quite popular right now. Luckily for me, since that's the business that I'm in. But it's not the only component that goes into having a successful big mountain climb. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about all the considerations. And this is a short list. I think it's 11 items that Steve House created and that I pulled off of an article that we wrote on our website, and just ways to think about where training fits into some of these different spots. So number one, and these are in rough order of importance. So from the most important to something that still people found effective, but not as important. So, this is subjective. If you disagree with any of those orders, you can get a Sharpie out and renumber them on your screen or cross them out as you like. But this is kind of the way we think about it. So number one, mountaineering experience or a guide to provide some of that background. And Steve even touched on this a little bit. You can't go from not being a climber to climbing a big peak successfully without a certain number of jumping off points in between. So, either you need to have that background yourself, or joining a guided trip, because the people managing that trip, especially somebody like Mike who has so much experience, can help you with that. If you don't have that, you're not going to be safe or successful for sure, especially safe. Number two, being healthy on a trip. You can show up as fit as you would like because your training's gone perfectly, and if you get horrendously ill, it's all for naught. So, having a trip plan and a logistical plan in place so that you can arrive at the mountain, and developing good habits to stay healthy throughout the expedition, which are really common on Everest. I think people do a really good job there. Other mountains, I think people, for some reason, are a little more lax about that. Their hygiene's a little more lax. They share food. They reach into each other's food kits, and grab chips out of someone else's bag. Things like that make a difference. So develop good health habits on your expedition and stay healthy. Number 3, supplemental oxygen, if it's appropriate for the peak that you're climbing. It's a big help. If you look at the statistics of how many people have climbed, Everest or other really high 8,000 meter peaks with and without oxygen, that's a pretty obvious help, and it's an important one. Aerobic fitness. Now we're kind of getting down to part of the topic of the day, and having a big aerobic capacity, which is going to be slightly genetic but can be largely developed, is one of the most important things you can do on the fitness side, because ultimately these peaks, one of the reasons that they're hard is the air is thin and it's hard to breathe. And if you have a big aerobic capacity, that is going to help you a lot. Whether or not you're using supplemental oxygen, you still have to have a big aerobic capacity. It's not easy. And that is primarily going to be developed through your low intensity aerobic training. And we're going to touch on that later, so I won't get too into that now. Favorable weather, of course, on any big mountain is super important. And it's one of the things that's not in your control. You can mitigate it by giving yourself extra time. You can have somebody on your team that you consult with. Maybe you have an expedition manager, like I know Mike does on his trips, who is very familiar with the weather patterns. And you can kind of maximize your chances there. But ultimately, you're going to need good weather to climb these good peaks, and nothing shuts an expedition down quicker than bad weather. And I think about Denali with this a lot, because I've done a lot of early season Denali trips. And if the weather's not good, you are not going anywhere. It doesn't matter how, who you are, how fit you are, or what 1, 2, 3, or 4 on this list look like. You need good weather. And then good route conditions are important. On a lot of the peaks, people are climbing the normal routes that we'll call them. And those routes are chosen for a reason, because they're sort of the path of least resistance, and they're frequently in good condition. But you do see some of these big peaks have, particularly avalanche conditions that are unfavorable, or they're extremely icy some years if it's been a windy winter and they get wind stripped. So those are things that are important to consider, and it can make or break a trip, or certainly make it harder for sure. And the next slide, nutrition, hydration. And this goes a little bit to Steve's point of taking care of yourself. These are not one-day events, and I think a lot of the times that people, they fail on these big expeditions, not because any one day was hard, but because they don't take care of themselves, and they get a little bit beat down day after day, and they're not able to recharge their batteries, because it's a harsh environment. It's high altitude. It's not easy to adapt and to rebound. But if you eat and drink to the best of your ability, and you have a plan for that goes a long ways. Movement efficiency. This kind of goes back a little bit to having a deep mountain experience. People that have climbed a lot have a way of moving uphill, have a way of standing on their crampons that's efficient. And you can take 2 people the same fitness, and if one person has climbed a lot, they're just going to be more efficient. And that really adds up, hours and hours, days of days into an expedition. And these are also things that you can train. You can train by climbing mountains, of course. But we do a lot of training with these muscular endurance workouts and specific strength training that do just let you move your body in a more efficient manner. And that's one of the other areas that training comes in and helps. Equipment choices, which Mike is going to go over today, are super important to keep you to be successful, but also to be safe, and to avoid cold injury and things like that. And then the 10 and 11 are altitude related. The pre-acclimatizing normal barrack chambers, which are seemingly becoming more and more popular, they are a help, I think. But if you look at where they are in this list, they're not number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. They can help people feel better. They can help shortcut the acclimatization time frame for some people, but it's not as important as those other things. And then the altitude training masks or training in a chamber. I've actually only had a couple of athletes train in this manner, and so I don't have a huge personal experience with it. And I think there is some data that it's helpful, but it's pretty low on my list actually. And I don't really get too deep into this unless people are super psyched. I think getting outside and training in a mountain environment or hilly environment, and just enjoying the training and being able to dive into it is maybe more important than using the mask. So there is no such thing as a free lunch. That is what that acronym stands for. So if anybody tuned in to see what the magic shortcut is, they don't have to train to go to Mount Everest. We just saved you an hour. You can just log out right now because that doesn't exist. In my experience in college, studying economics and thermodynamics, there was no such thing as a free lunch in those. My less than limited experience with relationships, there's no such thing as a free lunch with those. And there's no such thing as a free lunch with training for climbing big mountains. You do need to put in the time and you do need to put in the effort. That said, there are ways to train that maximize your time, right? You're not going to shortcut training, but depending on exactly where you are in your training and what you're training for, there certainly are ways to best spend that time and energy. And there is sort of what I think of as low-hanging fruit. So you start training with the lowest hanging fruit, you make the biggest gains that you can there, and then you move on to the next piece of lowest hanging fruit. And I think that's where educating yourself, becoming knowledgeable, being thoughtful about where you are as an athlete is a benefit, because it's not a shortcut, but it is not wasting time training with methodologies that aren't going to be helpful for you for that particular goal. So we're going to talk about there's sort of three slides here, and I sort of think of training in three different phases, sort of, not necessarily chronologically, but three different ways you train. And for big mountains, long expeditions, they're going to have long days, and all these mountains have long move days, and they certainly will have long summit days. Because of the duration of the activity and because of the limited oxygen in those environments, it is by definition a low intensity activity. You cannot maintain a super high intensity for very long, so that's not useful on a 12 to 20 hour summit day. But because of the limited oxygen, we'll go over this a little bit later too, the high intensity zones aren't really accessible to you anyway. So what you need to do is absolutely maximize your sub-aerobic threshold ability, and we kind of refer to that as aerobic capacity. And the way that you maximize that is you train in that zone, and you fine-tune all the things that go on with you physiologically in that zone. And that's not to say that you don't train hard in other ways, that, you know, that's on the next slide, but this is the bread and butter of training for endurance related activities, and especially high altitude endurance related activities. So it's a training modality that can take a lot of volume, and it can take a lot of frequency. The good news is that when you do this properly, you recover quite quickly. So this is something that people are typically doing, in the order of 5-6 days a week. And if you're not recovering day to day from this kind of training, you're probably training in an inappropriate zone if this is your goal. So you want to think about your recovery. You want to be recovering day to day. It's fairly low intensity, zones 1 or 2, depending on your particular physiology at the moment. And there's a little bit of misunderstanding about that. Most people that are new to training can train in zone 2. The fitter and fitter you become, zone 2 actually becomes pretty hard because you're fit and you might not be able to do big days of it and recover. So then you'd be more of a zone 1 athlete. Yeah, and this maximizes your aerobic capacity. It's by definition primarily fat burning, 50% or more fat burning, and we're going to go over that in a little bit, which is the goal, because we all, even the thinnest of individuals, and I'm fairly slight in build, and looking at Steve's face, he doesn't look particularly chubby either. We all have a vast amount of fat stores, more fat than you could ever burn on any expedition. So you want to be in that fat burning mode, and yeah, high frequency, high volume, recovering every day, and then getting back at it the next day. So then the second thing that I think about is intensity. And this is after you have developed a fairly robust aerobic capacity that we just talked about in slide 1. If you don't have a big aerobic capacity, going out and doing short duration intensity work only will not develop it. It's just a physiological fact. You will progress in intensity, and you will, if you go do intensity, you'll feel better doing intensity, and you will feel like you're making gains. And you actually make gains in relatively short duration sometimes with intensity work, and that's why it's suspiciously satisfying and addicting for people to do. And there is 100% a time and a place to do intensity work and train quite hard in this way, but it is after you have a vast aerobic capacity to build upon. So I think the second bullet point here, that it is not a substitute. Intensity is not a substitute for volume, is a really key take-home point. It is extremely helpful. It hopefully will become your low-hanging fruit and is what you need to work on, but it is not a replacement. You can't start with intensity, and you can't stop putting in low-intensity work when you start doing high-intensity work. So I think that's an important concept. Most people start with intensity 1 to 2 days a week because it doesn't take a lot when you're starting out, and 5% of your total volume of high intensity work by time. And this can be intervals. This can be longer duration workouts where you're going hard. In general, for people, this is later in their training cycle. And if it is later in your training cycle, you want it to be as sport specific as possible because you're going on your trip soon. So in general training, it can be not that sport specific. If you're 2 years away from your Mount Everest trip and you want to do some mountain biking to work on your aerobic capacity, that's fine, because it's not that sport specific, but it's cardio and it's helpful. If you're 6 weeks out from your taper for Mount Everest, a bunch of mountain biking is probably not the low-hanging fruit for you. You want to be footborne, you want to be weight bearing, you want to be putting out a backpack. So the intensity work that I do with people ends up being pretty sport specific, and it is one of a couple of things that a heavy pack can do. And we do a lot of these muscular endurance workouts where people they generally work up to about an hour. They start with like 30 minutes and work up to about an hour of really hard, very heavy pack. Something on the order of 25, 30 kilos is not unheard of for athletes. And they find a nice, really steep hill and they go hard for an hour. And that's a classic like muscular endurance intensity workout. Even for something like Everest, where the weight of that pack on that workout greatly outstrips the weight you would ever be carrying, as a client, like on one of Mike's workouts. The goal is not to get used to the pack carrying. The goal is to be strong and then be more efficient in your movement when you're not carrying a big pack, if that makes sense. So let's go on to number 3, and this is strength training. And like I mentioned, these are not in chronological order. I think that strength training is quite important for most people. I do work with a few folks who are just phenomenally strong naturally, like way stronger than you ever need to be to do something like a high altitude expedition. And it's not the low hanging fruit for them. We still do 1 day a week with those folks for the most part. I think it helps keep them healthy. And they'd work on some core strength and maybe some things that aren't their strong suits. With other folks, if they are a little more not inclined to be handy in the gym like those strong folks are, this can be a low-hanging fruit. It's good to be strong. It's also a thing that people go in the gym and they feel good on certain exercises and they tend to gravitate towards those. And that's not what strength training is about. Strength training is about finding what you're weak at and working on that. And sometimes that's not incredibly satisfying at first, but if you make gains in your weaknesses, that's by far going to be super helpful than working on things you're already strong at. And I like to keep it pretty simple in the gym. Basic lifts, things that use a lot of joints at once are time efficient. And mountaineering is it's a single-legged activity. Your legs need to be strong, but doing things like the traditional squat is great because it makes your legs strong. But at no point on Mount Everest are you going to put a lot of weight on your back and have a nice even platform where you can put both feet and bear all your weight on both feet and just have to stand up with a lot of weight, right? You have to take a step. You're stepping up onto a new surface with one leg. That surface might not be level. So things like box step ups, box step downs, things like that isolate one leg are quite good and quite applicable for mountain climbing. And the next slide. So this is a little bit for people that are visual learners. And this is a heart rate versus blood lactate concentration graph of the same person at two different times in their training cycle. And if you look at the first one, and I think this is kind of an important note here, the first one is somebody who has a big aerobic capacity, right? The first one is the goal. And if you can see, they're in zone 1 or 2 all the way up into, close to 150 beats a minute here before their blood lactate starts to rise basically above base level. And then their zone 3 is quite small. And this is where you want to be because you can move fairly efficiently, you can move fairly quickly, but you're still in a zone that's accessible to you at altitude in a low oxygen environment, and you're still in a zone that burns fat. And you can do this, the person that's the left graph can go for 12 hours at 140 some beats a minute, most likely, and be a really efficient contributing team member on a summit day. And on the right graph, this is what we see a lot when people first come to us. This is somebody who does not have a robust aerobic capacity. If they can work up to 120 beats a minute, which for most people is pretty easy to get to, and then they are starting to go anaerobic. Slowly, you can work in zone 3 for a while, but you can't work in zone 3 for 12 or 16 hours, right? So this is a person who does not look fit on this graph, but if you look at this person, they might be quite fit. This person might actually do a lot of training, but they don't train low intensity to lay that nice groundwork. And this is a person who struggles on long days and struggles at altitude. So this is where we see the people on the right, once we get them into a meaty amount of low intensity training, their graph actually shifts, and the same person then is the person on the left, and that's where you want to be for mountain climbing for sure. And so this is a kind of a different way at looking at the same thing. This is actual data from an experienced climber who's very fit, had already been to altitudes many times. And this is a constant velocity test, 2 different tests. If you look at the first one, their crossover point, which is where the blue line is fat burning. That's what percentage of your energy is coming from fat. The red line is carbohydrate burning. So you can see as the intensity goes up, you're burning less fat, more carbs, and eventually the 2 cross, right, at that crossover point. And that crossover point we like to think about as kind of the magic point where you want to do the majority of your training below that point and try and push your aerobic threshold up from below. You sort of push your aerobic threshold up from below primarily. You don't drag it from above. So you can see that this person's crossover point initially before training And this was the first test with the dashed line was in January. They were able to climb at this same speed on this treadmill at 11% grade before they started to go above that aerobic threshold. And then the second, solid lines, which was in April, so we'll say 5 months later, of pretty much only low intensity training, they were able to walk at that same pace on the treadmill at a 21% grade. So you can see that's almost a doubling of their ability to move uphill at a threshold that they can do all day long. So I think that's a really graphic, no pun intended, way of looking at it, that this really works. And this was somebody who was well trained when they came to us and had a lot of mountaineering experience. This is not someone who got off the couch and we were able to make them fitter. So I think that's an important point, and I really like this graph because it shows how well that works even in a 5-month time frame. And this is another chart. This is actual heart rate data from one of our athletes who was climbing Island Peak. And so this is summit day on Island Peak. And for those of you that may not be familiar with it, it's just over 20,000 feet. It's a popular trekking and acclimatization peak in the Himalayas. And if you're also familiar with it, you know that a 6-hour round trip summit day is not a super slow summit day. So this is not data from someone that was going very gently. This is data from someone that was going hard, right? And you can see their heart rate, the red numbers on the left, their heart rate was 110 beats a minute average for the day. And the kind of take-home point for me here is that even a well-trained athlete, and this was a very well-trained athlete who is going hard, they do not have zone 3, zone 4, zone 5 heart rates available to them. There's not enough oxygen to drive your heart into those heart rate zones, even if you want to. And because those are not accessible to you, there's no reason to train those. You need to train and maximize the heart rate zones that are accessible to you at altitude. And that's basically at best zone 2 for most folks. And so I think this is a really interesting way of looking at it for folks that like to geek out on this stuff, is that, this is an athlete that at sea level can drive their heart rate into the 170s very easily. And you can see, maybe we're lucky if this thing gets to 110 or 115 during this entire 6-hour summit day. So I think this was an interesting graphic for me to look at as well, and kind of a representation of why you need to really work on those zone 2 zones and be really efficient within those. So, better a diamond with a flaw than a pebble without. This is my sort of way of saying people like to go down the rabbit hole of training, and they like to think about what the perfect thing to do is. And I think that's valuable, and that's a lot of what I do with people. But training is never going to be perfect. And you're never going to be, perfectly ready for a trip. What you want to be is really fit and confident, and understand that there's always going to be imperfections. So just do the best you can. Get out of the house and do the work, because that's where the benefits come from. I love talking to people about whether, that this kind of workout's better than that kind of workout, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, as long as you're doing something intelligent and you're getting out and training, that's infinitely better than not doing the work at all. So don't get bogged down in the minutia. Put your running shoes on, put some weight in a backpack, get outside and do the work. And then usually the path will follow about how to fine tune that. The only athletes that I see that really struggle are the ones that didn't start early enough and didn't do the work. If you put in the time, you will make advances and get to the fitness levels that are helpful for your goals. So the biggest thing I think for folks, ideal folks that mostly they're pretty busy and training is time consuming. So prioritize the training, put it in your schedule, do it first thing in the morning, make plans with other people if that's motivating for you. Just set yourself up for success. Say, tomorrow I'm going to go training at 8 a.m. and I'm going to do it from 8 a.m. to 9:15. Don't say I'm just going to train at some point. It's not specific enough. Make it specific and hold yourself to the plan. Recovery is a huge, huge deal, particularly with people that are putting in big volumes of training really hard. We talk about training, we talk about loading the body and stimulus and et cetera. And in reality, those aren't the goals. The goals are to recover from the training and have your body adapt and be stronger. So remember that, recovering and then being stronger because of that recovery, that's the goal. And training without recovery is not going to get you anywhere. Sleep is incredibly important for that recovery, particularly people that do big volumes frequently. So really prioritize sleep, set yourself up well for that, develop good sleep hygiene habits, sleep on a really regular schedule, and an environment that is as good as possible. And I know a lot of folks have irregular schedules, a lot of folks have kids, like there are things that disrupt your sleep, but prioritize that as best you can. One rest day a week of complete rest or very easy aerobic work that's just purely recovery and very gentle is helpful for a lot of people. But I think more importantly, this is where I see a lot of self-coached athletes go wrong. Taking an entire week that's a little bit scaled back and easy, roughly once a month, every 4 or 5 weeks works well for people. This is really important for preventing overtraining. I see a lot of people progress their training in ways that are logical, but they just keep progressing. And at some point, you're going to hit a dead end with that. And that's where I think a lot of the overtraining comes from. Progress for 3 or 4 weeks, then ratchet it back by 50 or 60% in a rest week. Let your body reset and then have at it. And then the last thing, it's later than you think. No matter what your goals are, how big or how modest, if you get started tomorrow, that's not too early. As I'm sure Steve or Mike can attest, no one ever got on a summit day of these big peaks and came down to the end of the day and say, you know what, I really wished I'd not trained as much, or I really wish I'd started training much later, because that was a total waste of time. Everybody's like, they're like, thank God for every minute of training I did. Without that, I don't know if I would have made it back to camp. So, think about your goals. And even for a lot of us now, like maybe your big goals are a year out. That's great, but a year is not too much time. Take that as the blessing that we all have and start acting on it now. You'll be grateful. Yourself a year from now will be grateful that you started this week, not, at the end of the summer. And these are just some quick resources for people that are interested in further training advice. We have an active forum on Uphill Athlete, which I think is a great thing to engage if you have specific questions about training. A lot of the coaches are on there and answer questions. And we also have a really knowledgeable user base on that. So go to the forum and post a question and read and involve yourself. There is available online in our shop, the Mountain Performance Online Workshop. It's a 7-hour lecture. So what I just took, 20 minutes to talk about, there's 7 hours of information on there. I think it's incredibly valuable for the self-coached athlete. And I think it's $25 and you get a year subscription. You can watch it as much as you want for a year. So I really encourage people to watch that. That's a really good starting place. And it's a goldmine of training information. Steve and Scott's book, Training for the New Alpinism. Steve Howe, Scott Johnson is kind of what our company was based on, and it is a great resource for people that read. I assume there's people out there that still read and don't do everything online, but that's a great book. It's a great resource. And then if you have specific questions or you have questions about coaching, just email us at coach@uphill-athlete, and one of our coaches will get back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mark. And we do have a couple of those specific questions coming in the chat box, a little bit about injury, a couple about weight training, how long, what is that low-hanging fruit, what about the zones? So we probably won't have time to get to those today, but Mark has just given you the cheat sheet. I'll go back quickly. If you want to take a screenshot of that, the forum, the online workshop, the book, and then coach@uphillathlete.com. And then, of course, you can hunt down Mark. He's a phenomenal coach and has helped so many of our clients. So can't speak highly enough about what you guys do. One question I did have that came in on email, and it comes up a lot for us before we kind of switch gear here for us, Mark, is, you know, we have a few clients in their 50s and 60s and they're feeling, you know, am I too old? And they'd love to know if there's training advice that you have for, you know, a lovely aged bottle of wine. We get better, right?
Yeah, we have a few coaches that are in their 50s that will go nameless. It's a question I get a lot. People vary, you know, one person who's in the 50s, 60s is not another person, but I see some commonalities. As we age, you lose a few things. You lose muscle mass, so you're not as strong for sure. And you lose power because of that. And so one thing I see that I think people do wrong as they get older is they shy away from things they're bad at. So they don't strength train as much. They don't do the intensity work because they get bad at them. But to me, and what I found with our athletes who are a little older is that's all the more reason. Like, you have to double down on those things and not let those weaknesses just become crippling until you're just so weak that you can't move in the mountains effectively. So be dogged and religious about that strength training and do it all year round, every week, really methodically, and fight that backslide for all you're worth. And the other thing is, you know, older athletes, they do okay aerobically for this low intensity work. And this is what it's a lot about. And a lot of older folks, this isn't physiology, this is more social, but a lot of folks are in a place in their life where they have time. They may have the resources to train. Maybe their lives aren't as complicated. Maybe they don't have small kids at home. And so think of it being older as having opportunities that younger people don't have. You may have the opportunity to put in more volume because you just have the time, and you can build that aerobic base. So use those to your strength. And then the biggest thing I think with older folks is if you get injured or you get really sick, you backslide. And so do everything you can to remain healthy, be very methodical about how you train, and try really hard not to get sick. Be very careful with your hygiene habits, because if you lose a month of training and you're 65 years old, that's not like a 35-year-old who loses the month of training. So you have to be really cognizant of that, and just be very careful and very consistent, and always stay on top of it. So then you don't have to try and build it back and you're not fighting up that steep hill.
That's such great advice. Thank you. And, you know, I'd love to touch on some of that with Steve a little bit about, Steve, you know, you might not be in your older years yet, but you had some pretty bad injuries you had to overcome. You know, do you have any advice on injury recovery and training being injured?
Yeah, my body feels pretty old at times, I can tell you that, with sore knees and sore everything else. But I think on training in general, and just following on from what Mark was just saying, I think a lot of people actually overcomplicate and overthink training. Any training is just getting out and moving. Any movement is better than nothing. So just getting out and doing something is better than just sitting on the couch. For myself, I took quite an unstructured approach to my training. I might just made it up as I went, but interesting listening to what Mark just ran through. It was still following all the fundamentals and I guess the training principles that Mark was touching on there about having a good base endurance, then building strength and higher intensity. For myself, I took the approach of having it very unstructured because when I was younger, I did a lot of triathlon training, a lot of heavy endurance training, and I just got sick of following a rigid, structured training program. So in training for Everest, I threw the program out the window and I just went back to actually enjoying training. Still trained really hard, putting a lot of time, but just took a much more unstructured approach to it. And I think that's quite critical with training, is that there's a lot of programs, a lot of programs people can put you onto, but you've got to find a program that you enjoy, a program that you'll stick to. And it probably touches on what Mike started with. He does a lot of ski touring as his training because he enjoys it. So find activities and training that you actually enjoy and you'll stick to, in a program you'll continue with, I think is quite important. And again, with what Mark mentioned, with my own training, I switched, probably counterintuitively, but I switched more from the endurance training to actually incorporating a lot more strength training, a lot more higher intensity training. Because I had found over years of just pure endurance training, I had got very, very weak, to the point that I think it was contributing a lot to the injuries quite a number of the injuries I was sustaining. And once I started incorporating a lot more strength training back into my program, I found all around my fitness I felt improved quite a bit. So my training these days, it still does have quite an element of endurance-based training, but a lot more higher intensity and a lot more strength and gym-based work as well. For the, I guess, training with injuries and recovering from injuries, I think the most important thing is to just keep moving as much as you can within the bounds of what the medical professionals are telling you. So, when I was recovering from my neck injury, obviously the first couple of months, I was pretty well bedbound, couldn't do much at all. But even I had one of those great big halos on, so the pins into the forehead and the big frame and everything on. Even while I was still in that, once I got the stage, I could go home and I was in bed rest for a while. Then slowly could progress to walking around the house. And by month 3, I was doing 10K loops around the local river in my halo brace. In month 4, I started doing laps up and down Jacob's Ladder, which is a 250-step staircase up here in Perth, again, in my halo brace. And I think just keeping the body moving as much as possible, obviously without exacerbating the injury, is really important to help the recovery process. And for smaller injuries, and I'm always battling with sore knees and other things, there's always activities you can do to work around those injuries. So for myself, I've backed off a lot of running because I found that does contribute a lot to my knee problems and probably poor running technique and too much stupid mileage when I was younger. But I'll do a lot more swimming, rowing, biking and things, which I can still build up good endurance without smashing my knees too much. So yeah, on the injury side, one thing I'd say is just keep moving as much as you can, and just keep and work around the injuries. And with that also strengthen those weak areas. So don't avoid the gym days.
Yeah, that's awesome. So really the messaging coming through is having that balance between, all of the endurance and the strength and keeping your body in great condition in so many ways. And then, yeah, just keep moving, get moving. Mike, just quickly, and then we will change gear. You've been a guide for 20 years. What are the most common mistakes that you see once people actually rock up on the mountain? What's the most common mistake they've made in their training?
Yeah, I think training too much for strength, kind of going back to what Mark was talking about. It's good to train for strength and to have good general core fitness, but the majority of your training needs to be climbing specific. So tossing a pack on and going for a hike and getting in the vertical. That having big muscles, it's hard to oxygenate those muscles at altitude. So being big isn't necessarily an advantage. You look at guys like Mark and Steve and the Sherpa, and they're all pretty small, wiry guys. So not having too much muscle mass coming to the mountains. I think Mark touched on this as well. It's good to cross-train, doing things like cycling and swimming, but the majority of your training really needs to be climbing specific. So again, lots of vertical with a pack on your back. And, I see a lot of people training, especially people that don't have mountains nearby. They train on a Stairmaster, and that's a great tool to use, but you can't just train for the uphill. You need to train for the uphill and the downhill. So there's no substitute for getting out there, doing long days with a pack on your back and building those specific muscles to coming down as well. The climb is only you know, half the adventure. You need to be able to get back down as well.